In 1943, deep in the jungles of Rabaul, Japanese pilots laughed at a new American fighter called the Hellcat. To them, it looked like a flying barn, too heavy, too slow, too ugly to ever dance in the sky. They believed beauty and agility would always triumph over brute force. But they were wrong. What they were really facing was not just a new plane, but a new way of thinking, a machine born from industry, mathematics, and systems rather than honor and instinct. The Americans were not designing for duels, they were designing for dominance. The Japanese Zero was more than a fighter plane, it was a manifesto. It embodied a belief that individual skill and purity of spirit could overcome any material deficit. It was the perfect expression of the samurai ideal: light, precise, beautifully engineered for aerial duels. For 2 years it dominated the Pacific sky, its pilots dancing around the slower, heavier machines of the West. But beneath that grace lay a fatal flaw. It was a plane that treated survival as secondary to honor. When the United States entered the war, it didn't answer with romance or pride. It answered with an entire system, a machine of machines, factories, radar networks, training programs, logistics, and statistical control. Each Hellcat was a single component of a vast industrial organism whose goal was not beauty but overwhelming efficiency. In that contrast, craftsmanship versus system lay the true battle for the Pacific. When the war ended, the factories fell silent. On a quiet airfield in Japan, the last Zeros stood like ghosts of another era. Their designer, Jiro Horikoshi, studied a captured Hellcat and understood what had truly happened. "We built an aircraft for 1,941, he said. They built a system for 1,945. The Hellcat had done more than destroy Japan's air force. It had rewritten the logic of warfare. It proved that victory no longer belonged to the most skilled pilot or the bravest spirit, but to the civilization that could turn knowledge into machinery, coordination, and endless production." Saburo Sakai, the ace who once laughed at the Hellcat, later admitted, "We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were men with outdated weapons facing the future." The final truth of the Hellcat is not about speed or firepower. It's about the moment when humanity crossed a line, when the individual warrior ceased to decide the battle, and the system began to think for him. When engineers in Tokyo designed the Zero, they pursued perfection through subtraction. Every screw, every plate, every ounce was questioned. Armor was removed. Radios were optional. Fuel tanks were unprotected. The result was a featherweight predator, graceful, deadly, but fragile. It was the embodiment of a nation that believed skill could substitute for structure. In Long Island, American engineers at Grumman followed a different creed. They believed that the pilot's life was part of the weapons system. A plane that could survive hits and still fight another day was more valuable than one that could outturn its enemy once. The F6F Hellcat weighed nearly twice as much as the Zero, but inside that weight was logic. Armor for the pilot, self-sealing tanks, a massive engine that could climb vertically, and rugged wings that could take punishment. Where Japan crafted an artist's brush, America built an industrial hammer. Both were brilliant, but only one could endure the new kind of war that was coming. The first encounter came on a humid morning near Marcus Island in September 1943. Veteran Zero pilots spotted 6 dark shapes rising from the southeast. At first, they thought they were bombers too bulky to be fighters. Then came the shock. Those shapes climbed, fast and vertical, like nothing they had ever seen. The Hellcat didn't turn, it went up. When Petty Officer Fukui tried to follow, his Zero began to shudder and lose lift. The American plane kept rising, powered by its monstrous Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, 2,000 horsepower of raw industrial muscle. In seconds, the Hellcat flipped into a perfect hammerhead turn and dropped behind him. 6 Browning, 50 calibers opened fire, tearing through the unarmored fuselage. Fukui barely escaped, his aircraft riddled. His wingman never came back. The report that reached Rabaul was short but devastating. The enemy's fighter can climb like a demon. It does not fight as we do. The Japanese had just met a weapon designed not for art, but for annihilation. For 2 years, Japanese air doctrine had been built on a single rule: win the turning fight, outmaneuver your opponent, get behind him, and finish the duel with precision. But in late 1943, those rules no longer applied. The Hellcat pilots refused to turn. They fought in 3 dimensions, diving, climbing, and striking at angles the Zero couldn't follow. This new strategy was called energy fighting. It treated altitude and speed not as byproducts of flight, but as weapons. Every time a Hellcat climbed away, it stored potential energy. Every dive converted it into kinetic fury. Japanese pilots, masters of elegant aerial ballet, found themselves playing chess against an enemy who was using physics instead of grace. The more they tried to force the duel they knew, the more they died in one they didn't understand. The sky had become a laboratory of efficiency, and the Hellcat was rewriting the laws of air combat. What truly made the Hellcat unstoppable wasn't just the plane, it was the network behind it. While Japanese pilots hunted by sight and instinct, the Americans fought as part of a machine guided by radar. On carriers below, controllers watched glowing screens and moved pieces across an invisible chessboard. They saw formations forming 70, even 100 miles away, and directed squadrons to intercept with mathematical precision. Each Hellcat was no longer a lone warrior. It was a node in an industrial intelligence network that linked the sky to the sea. Radios once mocked by the Japanese as deadweight became lifelines that synchronized hundreds of fighters. The result was terrifying coordination. One Hellcat drawing attention, another diving unseen from above, both guided by unseen voices from miles away. For the first time in history, technology replaced intuition. The Americans had mechanized awareness itself, and the pilots of the Zero, proud heirs of instinct and honor, were now flying blind against an enemy that could see in the dark. At the beginning of the war, Japan's pilots were legends, warriors, molded by years of brutal training. It took nearly 3 years and over 700 flight hours before a naval aviator ever saw combat. They were masters, not soldiers, artists of motion and instinct. But by 1944, those masters were gone. The Hellcat was not just destroying aircraft, it was a racing experience. Every dogfight cost Japan something irreplaceable. Another veteran, another teacher. Fuel shortages meant new recruits trained on gliders. Ammunition was too precious for practice. Many had never fired their guns in the air before facing combat. Some couldn't even land properly on carriers. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the American system was producing pilots like an assembly line. Standardized training, simulators, and endless drills forged disciplined professionals. Each had logged hundreds of hours on the Hellcat before their first mission. They practiced carrier landings until their bodies moved without thought. When these men met the hastily trained Japanese pilots, the result was inevitable. The duel between skill and system was over, and the system had won. June 19, 1944. Over the Philippine Sea, Japan launched its last great carrier assault, Operation Ago. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, and the last hope of the Imperial Navy. Waiting for them was Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, half of them Hellcats. Radar picked up the Japanese waves more than 100 miles out. Controllers calmly vectored fighters to perfect intercept points. When the first Zero formations arrived, they met a wall of dark blue steel. In just 12 minutes, 42 Japanese planes were destroyed. They kept coming and kept dying. By sunset, 346 Japanese aircraft were gone. The Americans lost only 30. Pilots joked that it was just like a turkey shoot back home. Behind that grim humor was a deeper truth. The industrialized system of war had achieved total mastery. The Hellcat wasn't just winning battles, it was erasing an air force. By late 1944, Japan's air power was broken. Factories were bombed, fuel was scarce, and pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Imperial Command faced a grim equation. They could no longer outfight, outbuild, or outthink the enemy. So they changed the only variable left, the meaning of death itself. From this desperation was born the kamikaze. If a Zero could not return, then it would not need armor, nor fuel for the trip back. A pilot's life became the payload. Vice Admiral Onishi called it rational sacrifice. He calculated that a suicide strike had a 30% chance of success higher than any conventional attack left to Japan. Even then, the Hellcat met this new horror head-on. Over Okinawa, Hellcat squadrons intercepted hundreds of kamikazes, destroying most before they reached the fleet. The rest were shot down by flak and fighters, working together in a single machine of defense. It was the last proof of the system's supremacy. Even human will, weaponized, could not break the network America had built.